Section 24, Moses and the Torah. As the foundation of the Jewish tradition spanning thousands of years, the Torah is revered not only as a historical and literary document, but as the direct revelation of God's will and wisdom to the Israelite people through the prophet Moses. The cornerstone miracle of Judaism is the revelation at Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Torah from God, cementing his role as the primary prophet and establishing the covenant between God and the Israelites. Because of this, like we did with Muhammad, we have to naturalistically evaluate Moses' claim to prophethood and any miraculous contents of the Torah. To anyone mildly familiar with Abrahamic religions, of which Judaism is the eldest, it is important to state why we are evaluating Moses instead of Abraham. In Judaism, Moses and Abraham both hold profoundly important and distinct roles, but their theological importance in regards to Judaism's core claims is often viewed in relation to their different contributions to the faith. Abraham is revered as the patriarch and the founder of the Jewish people. He is celebrated for his faith and obedience to God, especially highlighted by the biblical narrative of the binding of his son, Isaac, the Akedah. Abraham's covenant with God marks him as a central figure in establishing the lineage that would become the Jewish nation. Moses, on the other hand, is often seen as the greatest prophet in Judaism, primarily because he served as the mediator between God and received the Torah, which includes the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Amongst topics like the Abrahamic creation myth and law, these books contain the narrative of Abraham, so the historicity of the Abrahamic covenant is somewhat connected to the credibility of Moses and the Torah. According to Jewish tradition, the miraculous events in the story of Exodus are the primary validation of Moses' prophethood. Although there is little archaeological evidence for the direct events of Exodus, which was believed to have happened around 1500 to 1300 BCE, we know a kingdom called Israel was established somewhere in Canaan around 1200 BCE because an Egyptian stone tablet called the Merneptah Stele, created in 1208 BCE, mentions it. As a baseline, we can assume either the Jews never were in Egypt and always in Canaan, they were not in Egypt as described in Exodus, or they were actually enslaved in Egypt as the Torah suggests. If we assume the Jewish people were enslaved under the Pharaoh and take the account of Moses' pre-prophethood life at face value, then we can start to develop a naturalistic theory of how he came to believe he was a prophet. Exodus starts with an order by the Egyptian Pharaoh to kill all male Israelite newborns because they were becoming too numerous to handle as slaves. Moses was discovered and adopted by the daughter of the Pharaoh after his biological mother, a Hebrew, was forced to abandon him in a basket in the Nile so that he wouldn't be killed in the purge. Moses was raised in the palace amongst the Egyptian royalty, yet slowly became aware that he is ethnically Jewish, which made him struggle with his identity. This internal conflict culminates decisively when he sees an Egyptian guard beating a Jewish slave to death. He chooses to intervene, kills the guard, and tries to hide the body in the sand. When the murder became known, the Pharaoh tried to have Moses killed, so he fled Egypt and found refuge with a Midianite priest. He married and had a son with a daughter of the priest, and remained with them until he was old. Considering his internal identity conflict never got resolved, it is not implausible to think that he felt like he had left his fellow Israelites behind to suffer while he enjoyed a decent life, and it weighed heavily on his consciousness. He even named his firstborn son Gershom, meaning a foreigner there, which the book of Exodus suggests is in reference to his flight from Egypt. If Moses had a strong emotional attachment to the Israelites he left behind, and it persisted over many years, it's plausible that he had a dream or vivid experience that convinced him that he needed to return to Egypt to free his people. He would be very aware that Egypt was an extremely strong kingdom, so whatever convinced him that he could succeed in this must have been profound. Moses would return to Egypt and unleash the 7 plagues, claiming they came from the one true God of the Israelites. These plagues included the Nile turning into blood, raining of frogs, swarms of lice, clouds of flies, pestilence of the livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of all Egyptian firstborn children. Scientists have theorized a fairly robust view of how some of these miracles could have happened naturally. First, a massive red algae bloom would have killed all the fish, made the water look like blood, and be undrinkable, which is exactly what Exodus describes. Frogs would escape the toxic algae en masse and swarm the land, jumping off of buildings and trees, metaphorically raining out of the sky. The frogs would die without water, and lice and flies would proliferate on their many corpses. An incredible amount of lice would swarm across Egypt, spreading diseases to the livestock and people, causing animal death and boils. If we assume the entire Seven Plagues story is a myth some ancient human made up, the odds of the author happening to pick these events, in this particular order, with specific details like the water stinking and all the fish dying, is very unlikely. Instead, the narrative's accuracy to what we would expect of the downstream ecological effects from a catastrophic red algae bloom lends the account some historicity, even if the author was mistaken about the supernaturality of the event. Yet after this point, developing the naturalistic account starts to get more dubious, as it relies heavily on chance. The occurrence of hail and locusts would have to be explained as natural happenstance, and the darkness would presumably be from ash traveling from a volcanic eruption on the Aegean island of Santorini, which may have happened around the time Exodus supposedly occurred. While all of these events can certainly happen naturally and independently, if they occurred shortly after Moses' return to Egypt, that would constitute a very unlikely coincidence. The death of the Egyptian firstborns is also hard to explain. It has been theorized that Egyptian firstborn children had special privileges, and so may have been the first to eat food contaminated with toxic red algae, leading to death. But then we might expect many more deaths, and not just of firstborn Egyptians, as Exodus records. Regardless, after these events, the Pharaoh relents and lets the Israelites go. Yet after a short time, he changes his mind and pursues them with his cavalry. Exodus records that Moses splits the Red Sea with God's help in time for the Hebrews to cross it before letting the waters return, enveloping and drowning the Pharaoh's army. From a naturalistic view, scientists have theorized that this event actually happened at the Sea of Reeds, which could have receded with a strong wind or earthquake, allowing crossing by foot, before flooding suddenly when the splitting phenomenon ended, which would drown any chariot-based force. The wind theory is particularly interesting, as the Exodus account mentions an eastern wind. Although it would have to be another major coincidence for the waters to move and recede, just in time to let the Israelites pass, but destroy the Pharaoh. At the end of all of this, Moses and the Israelites are free in the wilderness. Even if everything until this point actually coincided naturally by sheer chance, we could reasonably assume Moses was confident in his own prophethood. If Moses was confident in his own prophethood, then he could believe any of his internal monologue was divinely inspired. If his identity as a distinct Hebrew was of critical importance to him, then it is not incredibly surprising that much of what he reveals in the Torah is about setting the Hebrews apart from all their neighbors. During this process, Moses reportedly becomes extremely frustrated by the Hebrews trying to become like the other cultures in the region, by adopting their gods, dubious ethical practices, or trying to return to Egypt. Given how critical his identity as a Hebrew was to him, it makes sense that he would be angry at Hebrews who didn't seem to value it as much as he did. Thus, he cracks down harshly against this behavior, even calling for death for anyone who worshipped something other than the true God. His long-term solution might have been to codify what Hebrews are and are not supposed to do through writing the Torah, a project he might have felt he had the license to do if he was convinced he was a prophet talking to God. Hence, the documents that make up the Torah are written, including the 10 Commandments, the Abrahamic creation myth, instructions for building the tabernacle, and various laws written explicitly to set the Hebrews apart from their neighbors as a moral people. This is not to imply Moses fabricated everything in the Torah. Jewish tradition holds that he wrote down notions the Hebrews had passed along via oral tradition, like the story of Abraham's covenant and Jacob bringing the Hebrews to Egypt. If there aren't any similar stories in any cultures the Hebrews originated from, it could suggest Moses shared Torah's narrative for the first time. Considering the Hebrew culture was originally from the Near East, there is evidence of cultural borrowing, given that portions of the Torah are similar to other mythological events or practices in other Near East cultures, like the ones found in Mesopotamia. The story of Noah's Ark is similar to the story of the hero Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a character who is warned by the Mesopotamian god Ea of an impending flood and is tasked with building a boat to save pairs of every animal. A major theme of the Epic of Gilgamesh is also found is the quest for immortality from a plant, a narrative element echoed in the Tree of Life in Eden, which Genesis reports was around Mesopotamia. Beyond similarities with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story about the Tower of Babel echoes the Mesopotamian practice of building ziggurats, which were believed to be towers to the gods, and some of the legal codes in Leviticus echo the Hammurabian eye for an eye style of law. However, these stories are presented quite differently in the Torah, with the common theme of ethical monotheism. In the Mesopotamian flood myth, the flood happens because of the capriciousness of some gods, whereas in the Abrahamic flood myth, God unleashes a flood onto mankind as a punishment for their total depravity. The construction of ziggurats was considered a holy practice in Mesopotamia, whilst the Tower of Babel is used as an example of how God confounds the hubris of mankind. Rather than questing for immortal life like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Eden narrative suggests mankind lost immortality with God due to their desire for power above God. The legal codes of Leviticus and the Ten Commandments are framed around what God has identified as good or bad, rather than obeying the morality of a Mesopotamian king. It is not clear if these differences were innovations on behalf of Moses to instill a new notion of ethical monotheism into the Hebrews, or just formal recordings of long-standing belief in ethical monotheism going back all the way to Abraham. In either case, the apparent parallels to Near Eastern cultural origins may actually lend the story of Abraham some historicity, as the Torah records he lived in Mesopotamia before migrating to Canaan. Of course, this doesn't validate every claim the Torah makes about Abraham, but it does suggest there is some truth in the story. Beyond Abraham, the presentation of some events recorded in Genesis sit in stark contrast to current scientific understanding of what they claim to record. So few Jewish scholars use the claim of miraculous scientific foresight to support the Torah, unlike the other literature-based belief systems like the Vedas and the Quran. Only if one applies a non-literal understanding of what constitutes a day for a timeless God in the Abrahamic creation myth, or views the inclusion of 100 days as a metaphor for chronological succession, one might be able to claim there is a little miraculous scientific foresight within the Abrahamic creation myth. Genesis records that God created the heavens and the earth, then he created light which made day and night, then he made the oceans and the sky, then bodies of land, then vegetative life, then the astrological bodies, then fish and birds, then land animals, then humans. It's a bit of a stretch, but the Big Bang making the heavens and eventually Earth, the Archean eon of the Earth where it was covered in ocean and developing an atmosphere, the appearance of land masses later in the same eon, the proliferation of cyanobacteria and vegetative life from the Paleo-Archean era to the early Cambrian period, the increasing visibility of the sun and moon due to the clearing of methane in the atmosphere by the cyanobacteria, the Cambrian explosion which led to the evolution of early aquatic creatures, though not birds, the appearance of land animals in the Paleozoic era, and then humans within the Cenozoic era, all very crudely align with the chronological sequence of events presented in the Genesis narrative. As crude as it is, it would be an impressive guess on behalf of whoever made it. In fact, of all creation myths in any ancient belief system, it is probably the most accurate. On the other hand, claims of all of humanity descending from Adam and Eve, a global flood in the story of Noah lasting over 10 months, and ancient humans living over 600 years, all fly in the face of the scale of empirical evidence we'd expect to support them. Of course, evolutionary theory does hold that humanity descended from the same pair of proto-humans, but the Torah account suggests Adam and Eve appeared on Earth less than several thousand years ago, which would not provide sufficient time to produce the large populations we see across the globe during that period. There is nowhere near the evidence we would expect for a literal global flood, though some argue there is evidence for a regional flood, and there is no evidence at all for ancient humans living past the oldest humans of our time. Although the miracles that validate Moses may have occurred naturally, the Torah remains distinct as a source of codified ethics that far exceeded what was typical of the time. Even though some of the stories typically treated as historical fact are highly dubious, the messages behind them remain as excellent examples to the Jewish and other Abrahamic traditions on the importance of a moral life. Regardless, we must decide how credible we think the miraculous events around Moses' life were, and if they validate his claims to divine inspiration.